Wow, welcome, beloved. Wow. Now, I'm excited. I hope you are too. It's been maybe a month. We took a little sabbatical to begin to study and work on season two. We completed season one. Give us, give yourselves an applause, standing ovation, and we're going to start with season two. And one of the things with season two that I thought about, I wanted to have more scripture, but I also wanted to do some contextual stuff, right? Some historical context as well as cultural context into uh, our approach to the scripture as we, go through Exodus, right? So we're going to go through Exodus, and I'm going to, see how this format goes and follow along, but definitely want to add more scripture and add more context. Okay, more context, because one of the things that I see a lot of times where people use scripture out of context. If that makes sense. Okay, so again, welcome, and we're going to do this like we have done it before, and we're going to create that safe container. So close your eyes, relax, make sure uh that your spine is straight, make sure you're comfortable, and close your eyes. Remember, breathe in, breathe out. Breathe in all the positive energy. Breathe in that positive energy. Breathe in those things that are uplifting, those things that are loving, forgiving. Breathe those things in. Breathe in, breathe out. Breathe out the negativity. Breathe out the world, especially what's going on right now in the world and in this country. It can be overwhelming. We're going to let those things go. Breathe it out. Cleanse yourself, okay? Breathe in, hold it. Think of those positive things. Think of those things that bring you love and light. Breathe out. Breathe out. All the air out of your diaphragm and breathe in a nice big breath and let it out. Okay? So this is the first episode, episode one of season two. Season two, episode one, season two. We're going to get into the book of Exodus. So this episode is Egypt consciousness, Egypt consciousness, understanding bondage patterns, understanding bondage patterns, because it's not so much physical bondage, right? Physical bondage that keeps us from being all that we can be, for God being all that we can be, for the creator and source energy. It a lot of times it is our mental bondage, but especially our spiritual bondage. Those things that keep us bound conscious. Okay, so we begin our Exodus journey by understanding the Egypt consciousness, both in ancient times and within ourselves. Okay, in within ourselves, and I said earlier that we want to do some context, right? So in this context, this historical and cultural context, uh, we know that it happens in Egypt right now. We know that Joseph, right? Joseph was, second in command to Pharaoh as we end, and he reunites with his brother, with his father, and they've all relocated to Egypt. Okay, and now they're in Egypt, right? And the Pharaoh that was kind, where Joseph was second in command, he's no longer there, right? He's gone on. And so that Pharaoh and who knew Joseph and who knew his people was gone. And so we come into this time, right, where in this the children, it's the generations of Israel, the generations of Jacob now that are dwelling in Egypt, particularly Goshen, and they've grown. And so the present Pharaoh, he is afraid. He's like, they've grown in numbers. They, if they wanted to, they could overcome us. And so he put taskmasters over them, and then there was an edict to kill all the firstborn males. Right? You remember that, right? So this is what we are. We're in this Egyptian. So the historical and cultural background is the Egyptian Empire, right? And the Hebrew settlement has now moved into slavery. They've moved into physical bondage, right? They have moved into physical bondage, and they're now a part of this whole thing. And what's important to understand too is the Nile Valley and this civilization. This civilization has come up through southern parts of Africa, settled into the Nile Valley, because the Nile Valley is it's flourishing, right? It's fed by the Great Nile River, and so there is also these systems that are in place, right? These not only political systems in place, but also religious uh, religious systems that are in place. Okay, so some of the key things we want to understand, in there is as far as metaphysics is concerned, is liberation from bondage, divine identity, our divine identity, consciousness transformation, divine law, and sacred community. So liberation from bondage is super important, because we're going to talk about moving from limited thinking to spiritual freedom. Moving from limited thinking, right? Limited thinking to spiritual freedom. So the Exodus story symbolizes humanity's journey from spiritual bondage to liberation, right? It's a universal path of transformation that mirrors our individual spiritual growth. Our individual spiritual growth by studying these texts from a metaphysical standpoint, from a metaphysical lens. Because I would say that to do just a literal or even a moral take at the scripture, it really is not very profitable, and it's not very spiritual. And a lot of times when you do that, we get out of context, and we get in trouble. Okay, so when we look at this through a metaphysical lens, we discover timeless wisdom. Timeless wisdom. So as we talk more and we deal more with historical context, you help you understand that and cultural context, to look at it historically and culturally and try to place it into a different culture, right? 2,000, 5,000 years later, all right? And I don't believe that these writers even thought, there was somebody 5,000 years later that was going to read, or understand what was going on, and let alone try to apply it to the modern understanding. Okay, so we through this metaphysical lens, we discover timeless wisdom that can be applied to our personal spiritual practices and daily lives, and that's what we want. Okay, so have this context, this historical and cultural context. We know that we have those in power are the Egyptians, right? From those that are in Pharaoh's house down to scribes and priests and farmers and slaves. Okay, and we know what's going on. The Hebrews now are in bondage. So we have this. We talk about this Egypt consciousness. This Egypt consciousness, and Egypt represents limitation. Okay, Egypt represents limitation consciousness, or a what? A consciousness of lack. I know it's we can pick up certain things, that are consistent from Genesis to now, and that what is a consciousness or a spirit of lack or a limitation consciousness, right? So now this limitation consciousness that we revealed in the garden, because I believe that's where we fell away. I believe that's where if we want to call it a original sin, and I want to use it from the purest form of sin or explanation or definition, which is to fall short, right? Fall short. And so in falling short, you're already limited, right? And so to have this limited or lack consciousness, then we have sinned and we've fallen short of the target that's been set by our Creator. Okay. So and there's these patterns of bondage that we will uncover. We know we talked about physical bondage as we read here, and spiritual bondage and emotional bondage. Okay, mental bondage. All these kind of things are super important. Now Egypt also represents not just limited or a limitation consciousness, but it's limited to a material consciousness, right? It represents, really being, sort of aligning with what we talked about earlier, which is a Cain consciousness, which is what? Limited, basically, because of its focus on material things. And it's attached to the external conditions, right? Those things outside of us, not very spiritual. And that is, a Egypt consciousness, right? And also a part of that whole thing is, this power structure where we have a hierarchy, right? A hierarchy. And I know that we read scripture and they have and we for whatever, and I think we have to have this hierarchy, and we know that ultimately we have God, ultimately we have source, ultimately we have the Creator, but we join the Creator in creative work, right? We know from scripture that there's the great I am, but we also have to understand that we are I am as well. Okay, but for man, we have to have these power structures, whether it's a king, whether it is a bishop, whether it is a president. We have these power structures. And in those power structures, there is no sharing of resources. There is no unity. There is no real DEI. Yeah, I had to go there, right? There is the haves and have-nots, and it's really where this country is trying to move back. And there's there is your existence is controlled. It is about control. So that is, really what Egypt represents, and from a cultural context, the worldview is what influenced by the Egyptians. Right, the worldview is controlled or is influenced by the Egyptians, and so now through these generations of Hebrews, they have been influenced by what? A culture that's not theirs. Does that feel and sound familiar? Okay, and so they, from a cultural standpoint, like I said, I want to get. So we have an Egyptian worldview, and these people influenced by that, and so, but because of that influence, they have to maintain their Hebrew identity. After all these generations of being in Egypt, they've had to be able to maintain their identity as Hebrews. And so we know that to be the case because when we get into the Great Liberator, and we'll talk about what that means metaphysically, But Moses knows that he is what? He knows he's a Hebrew, even though he is raised and brought up in Pharaoh. Okay. And then the impact of this societal structure, right? What is the impact, right? There is an impact because go back, we talk about structure. We talk about this structure that they have to deal with, and we talking about again. We're talking about we have the those that are royalty. Then down from that we have those that are scribes and those that are artisans, right? Those that are scribes, those are that are artisans, those that are priests. So you have Pharaoh and the nobility. You have artisans and scribes. You have farmers and laborers, and then you have the slaves and the foreign workers. And so we can see where the Hebrews were on that in that structure. Okay. And what that impact must have been, on them, right? Just building culture, building the context here. And so now, you have there is a survival consciousness. Why? Because even though there's these other structures, and not so much the haves and have-nots, even though it's there, you have these uh, uh, Hebrews, right? These Hebrews who come from through the lineage that are now, right, now have to think about their mere survival because of these task masters. Okay, so that is there's this understanding of what Egypt represents as far as the limitation consciousness. Also, it gives you wanted to give you that cultural context, right? This cultural context. So, uh, like modern systems of limitation, we face these modern systems of limitation. Look again. I mean, could there be a more glaring example than what's going on politically and socially in this country? Right? We have these systems that are in place, especially for Black people. Systems have been in place to limit us. Now we've had people who've been able to still thrive, not just survive but thrive in with these systems in place. Yes, but far and few in between. Okay, so there's still we're talking about economic dependencies, having to depend on the government, have to depend on limited resources, have to depend on a job that where you're robbing Peter to pay Paul, and then also social conditioning. We have been conditioned, right? You become conditioned, through these social structures. We're conditioned by, our parents. We're conditioned by our community. We're conditioned by, our churches, organizations. We have this social conditioning that we have to do, and then there's this cultural expectation. We have to still, there's an expectation that's on us, a cultural expectation, especially from within our own culture. We know that from another culture standpoint that we are never going to. We always have to explain. That's what the whole thing with DEI, even though it DEI applies to so many different communities, right? Once it was identified as something that would help, or Black people, right? For them, it was that now that we gave Black people an advantage, and then so therefore other people, especially white people, white men, were at a disadvantage. Okay, so there is this expectation from one culture that we could never be enough. And if we are at a certain place, then we had to get help from them. And then we have our own internal cultural expectations that we have to be better, that we have to be 10, 20, 100 times better than everybody else. And so And then we have to deal with our own personal restrictions, our personal restrictions, our thinking, right? That limitation consciousness, okay? That lack mentality, right? And so we put these restrictions on ourselves. So now, and then, what are these bondage patterns? So, here, there's physical bondage, right? There's these metaphors that are within, this story. And we know that there's metaphors throughout the Bible because it was written in code. It started out as, and so I remember there is a literal, right? A literal lens. There is a moral lens, and there is an allegorical or metaphorical lens, as well as a metaphysical lens. So, this physical bondage, there are these metaphors that we can see in there. Brick making, right? So brick making, which is a repetitive pattern, right? You do the same thing. You mix, with the mud, with the straw, and you're making the brick. You dry them out, then you place them. So it's this the repetitive pattern. Then you have the task, which are our inner critics, right? So we have this repetitive thought, which is brick making, and these repetitive patterns that we continue to do, right? Just like hey, to get the straw, whatever. But we have our own internal, right? These are the metaphors for ourselves. These are metaphors, okay? So we have repetitive patterns, and we have our inner critics. We have those thoughts that run in our heads that tell us that we can't do it, right? Those inner critics. And then we have, hard labor. So they remember the taskmaster made it harder they had to make bricks without straw. So that hard labor. And we do. So we have this struggle consciousness where we have to struggle. And it is, and that consciousness is, we run into it in churches where, if you're not struggling and you're not pious, then you're not spiritual. You got to go through some stuff. We all got to go through stuff, but we don't have to struggle. And it was not meant for us to struggle. But we had to struggle consciousness. And then it was no rest, right? So, we know from just, the slavery or chattel slavery in this country that, they had to work from sun up, to sundown, right? And do it all over again. So there's this constant doing. There's no rest. There's no rest consciously. Our mind is running, and we're always constantly doing rather than being. And we were created as human beings, but we're constantly doing. Okay. So, this is historical context. There's the Egyptian slavery system. There's these economic structures. There's social hierarchy, and there's power maintenance, right? So you continue from not just, political power, but also religious power. Okay. And, we're talking about the Hebrews that were monotheistic and the Hebrews that are polytheistic. Okay. So what are some modern bondage patterns? What are some modern bondage patterns? Because we want to make sure as we look at this contextually that we're able to now, once we see it through one lens, be able to begin to understand it, from, as, we give it a teachings. What are the teachings? What are the modern bondage patterns? What about financial dependencies, right? Financial dependencies, relationship patterns. We see, how, these relationships, how our relationships with our parents, with ourselves, how it, relates over into our own families and to our own different relationships. Career limitations, right? Career limitations. So these are modern bondage patterns, financial dependencies, relationship patterns that keep us in bondage. And some of us are in relationships that we should really break out of. We should really break out of it, not just between spouses, but between friends or so-called friends, just toxic relationships, and also health struggles. And I for one, can really identify with this. I think, even during our first season, I had this cough, and still, I've had tests and all different things that have an appointment coming up. But, we have these health struggles. Okay. These health struggles. So now we've covered those things. We've covered these patterns. We've covered these cultural contexts and historical contexts, and then how would we mirror those things spiritually and internally in our modern context. Okay, so as we begin to prepare for the liberator, this liberation consciousness, which is represented by Moses. Okay, we before freedom comes, okay, before freedom comes awareness. Before freedom comes awareness. You first have to be aware of your situation. Right? You first have to realize that you're in bondage. I know that, and it's been debated uh, whether Harriet Tubman actually said this, that, I freed 100 slaves and I would have freed 100 more if they had known that they were slaves, right? And I'm not sure. I know it's been ascribed to Harriet Tubman, but it's been some debate. But anyway, you have to what? You have to be aware that you're in bondage in order for you to seek freedom. Does that make sense? Okay. So you have, there is this, recognition of bondage. Know that you're in bondage, recognition of bondage, whatever type of bondage that is, right? And you have to have a desire to change, a desire for freedom, because there were folk who were left, on the plantation, and not just talking about a physical plantation, but a spiritual plantation as well. A lot of us are going to be left in spiritual bondage, on spiritual plantations, if we don't have a desire for change. And it has to be an inner cry for help. And some of us remain in bondage because we don't want to ask for help. We don't seek help. We don't ask for help. But we know that what? That, that God, right? God heard the cries of his people. And when he heard the cries of his people, he did what? He then sent them a lift. All right. And so there has to be this divine response. Remember that there was response from God, but there's also, right? Moses, the liberator, had to have a understanding of who he was. He really had to have an understanding of his inner divinity as well. We'll get more into that, into something that I as I looked at this scripture over and over, especially that a story of the burning bush. I had some revelations that I will share. Okay, so we have those contexts and other context we want to get to, and this might be a little longer, because I want to lay the groundwork. Remember, I wanted to bring in some context, and so when you have this context, then we can be able to move through the other episodes of the season. But I wanted to bring this context. I think is very important. So now we have that historical context. We have the cultural context. We have the cultural context, okay, and now the geographical context, because it's super important. The geography, especially, was important, right, for the survival, for Egypt to be, what Egypt became for the world. Okay, so we have this Nile River, and there is symbolism in what the Nile represents. Okay, there is this symbolism, okay, for what the Nile represents spiritually. Okay, the Nile, that was the lifeblood of Egypt. And one of the interesting things about the Nile is how it flowed, right? Normally it flowed south to north. Okay. So that, that's something we're touching. Well, so we have this now, what the now symbolizes, then in the Goshen settlement, which is important because it plays important in this scripture, especially when the plagues happen, and then other parts of Egypt are going through certain things where those in Goshen were not. So the Goshen settlement. Okay, where is that Goshen settlement when it comes to our spirituality? When it comes to our conscience, we have to understand where that Goshen settlement is, that there might be things that are going on around us, okay? But however, because of this Goshen spirit, it's not really affecting us. And then building projects. Building projects is super important because spiritually, our spiritual command is to be fruitful and multiply, which means to build. Use our creative power, right? Use who we are as co-creators and build. And so we see building is one of those things that is important. They use slave labor to do what? To help build the cities, build the pyramids, okay? Build the storage facilities for the grain because of how the Nile River and how things would grow. Then during surplus they would store up the grain. We know that, and then we'd have it for whenever there's other downturn in what I would say the economy. Okay, but so there's these things, and then the proximity to the desert, because it is going to be important as we know that after the liberated comes, as liberation consciousness go, we're going to go into a desert. We're going to wander, okay? And so the proximity is important. The proximity is important from Egypt, right? The desert proximity from Egypt also to the promised land, that proximity. So the thing is, we have to have this awakening. Like this awakening to our limiting beliefs, right? Our own repetitive patterns, our own growth barriers, those things that keeps them from growing, and then our potential for freedom, our potential for freedom, our potential for freedom. Okay, so we want to do as we did before. Again, this is going to be a little longer, but excuse me, they all won't be this long. I just wanted to lay this groundwork, this cultural, these contextual platforms, contextual foundations. Okay, so we're working with this Egypt consciousness. All right, number one, pattern recognition, identifying our limiting beliefs, notice our repetitive struggles, observe control systems. Okay, observe these control systems. These things that control us, especially these external things that control us, and then see our resistance points. Okay, right. And so we want to make sure that we have this awareness practice, be aware of these things daily. So we want to make sure that we in the morning, checking morning pattern check, our midday limitation notice. Right, notice those things that limit us. Right? And then once we make that notice, then we can figure out and work a plan, to do what? Break us free. And then our evening freedom preparation, because you have to be aware. You have to prepare for freedom. You have to prepare for freedom. And notice that in the scripture, if you go back and read it, that, God had given them the plan to prepare, and he told them to go to, especially the women, to go to the women of Egypt, right? And ask, for the preparation, the gold and all these different things, okay? For that, for that time. We have to be prepared. So now we're going to end up, in this section. I'm so happy that we, get started. Man, and once, it's just, I can't, I anticipate our next time together. But as we do, again, we want to make sure that we end this in meditation. Okay. So as we begin to journey into our awareness, Journey into that awareness. Journey and prepare for liberation. Prepare for freedom. We got to go through, this slavery. We got to go through this bondage. We got to go through this Egypt consciousness, right? In order to get to a place where we can truly appreciate the freedom. So, again, close your eyes, settle, breathe in, feel your diaphragm, breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, deep breath, breathe in, breathe out. Feel, your current limitations. Notice your bondage patterns. Recognize your divine potential and allow that freedom to begin, that spirit of freedom to begin to stir within you. Okay? Breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, hold it, and breathe out. Okay, beloved, until next week, remember, right, that awareness precedes freedom and recognition enables change. You're never truly bound. You're always connected to source. Okay. Peace, love, and light.